All right. Well, so yeah, we can kind of go ahead and get started. So thanks everybody for joining us. We're excited to have a session to talk about what executives, founders, and investors need to know about the current hot topics in the political environment. It's kind of a great day. It's Earth Day to have this. The president's having his climate summit, and the market's also down pretty heavy based off of some of the recent tax news, particularly related to capital gains. So actually a really interesting day to have this conversation. My name is MACKAY JIMESON. I'm president of Ember Global Advisors. I help companies navigate a complex landscape of regulation, politics, public opinion, etc. And I'm joined with three friends, three incredibly knowledgeable people across the legislative economic landscape. Ike Brannon, Chelsey HICKMAN, and OZZIE PALOMO. I'll let each of you introduce yourselves as well as what you do. Ike, why don't we start off with you?
Great. So I run a consulting firm called Capital Policy Analytics. I'm also a senior fellow at the Jack Kemp Foundation. And before I did this, I spent a decade in government. I worked on the Senate Finance Committee with Chelsey's husband, coincidentally. I also served on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and spent some time working on tax policy for the U.S. Treasury and the Office of Management and Budget.
Great. Chelsey.
Chelsey HICKMAN, glad to be here. I spent 10 years on Capitol Hill. I spent 5 years in the Senate and then 5 years in the House. And when I finished, I was the chief of staff for Congresswoman Kate Granger, who's currently the top Republican on the House Appropriations Committee. I am a partner at Winning Strategies Washington. We're a boutique lobbying firm in DC, and we handle primarily funding, appropriations, and other budget-related issues. But really, we have a wide variety, everything from patient advocacy to institutions of higher education to defense contractors, Fortune 500 companies, and we help them, kind of like MACKAY said, navigate DC and try to avoid landmines and try to take advantage of opportunities when they arise. So glad to be here. Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. OZZIE.
Great. Thanks for having us. And OZZIE PALOMO, Chartwell Strategy Group, one of the founding partners of the firm. We're a public affairs government relations firm in Washington, multifaceted, kind of a generalist firm, broad range of clients ranging from financial services to higher ed to telecom, as well as some sovereign work. Excited to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Great. Well, so as I mentioned, it's Earth Day. The Biden administration is holding its climate change summit. I believe the Pope attended, Bill Gates, others. The big news is certainly an effort to reduce emissions by 50% below to the 2005 levels by 2030. It's a pretty ambitious goal. I was reading what the White House put out earlier today, and what I thought was interesting language was the tie around job creation and climate change work together. I wanted to talk a little bit about this. You know, early in the president's term, there was the executive order involving XL Keystone Pipeline, of course, that had a direct impact on jobs. I would love to get your perspective. This climate bill has had a lot of attention for months now. What from your perspective are sort of the economics at play here? You know, what's going to be the impact on jobs, both good and bad?
Well, yeah. First in alphabetical order. I'll go first. I think a lot of it depends on what the state of the economy is in the next couple of years. If the economy is fairly close to full employment in 2022, which I think is going to be the case, then there's no reason to think it's going to have a big impact on employment, right? If it does take a lot of people to build up these new facilities, like charging up charges for electric cars or things like that, they're going to come from somewhere else where these people are already employed. So I think the gains will be minimal. And then the other thing is that going more from a carbon-based economy to a green economy doesn't necessarily create any jobs either, other than the small ones created in this transition, because what we find is that energy efficient jobs tend to be labor efficient as well, right? So it doesn't take a lot of people. Once you install solar panels, it doesn't take a lot of jobs to keep these things going. Ditto with windmills and all that. So to me, I think the argument that we need these for good jobs is misleading. We need to do these things, I think we need to do them because we need to transform our economy. And the fact that fewer people will be involved in producing energy is a good thing. Then we'll have more people available to do something else. So I think this whole idea that we're going to do this because of jobs is misleading, and to me it's faulty rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in there, I think what I would add is it's obviously following a trend that you've seen that we're a week out from the 100-day marker for the Biden agenda, and they pretty much have stuck true to form of what was included in Build Back Better. And I think, as ambitious as this climate plan is out there now, and it's multifaceted, right? You're also coupling that with their infrastructure proposal, which got rolled out a couple of weeks back. And I think one lesson that one lesson that they've learned from 0809 is a little bit of that scarring effect, where they literally felt like they could have done more when they had the power back then, and they're certainly doing a hell of a lot more now. And it's not, they wanted to get this in for the first 100 days. So I think, to Ike's point, a lot of this is going to be dependent on how the economy kind of proceeds over the next several months and into next year. But they certainly have had a go big and go hard approach to it, and they're sticking true to the campaign promises.
I would just add to that, I think this is whatever your feelings are with the previous administration, it was a very business friendly administration, and that it's a 180 for there. I think Ike said it well. It's not really about jobs. It's not really about economic development. They pay a little bit of lip service to that, but there is a very different focus on what matters. And I think that they're not as interested. The administration is more interested in making those big leaps and making those big, having those big gains, because, as OZZIE said, they feel like they missed an opportunity a decade ago. And so they have a limited window of opportunity here where they have the House, the Senate, and the White House. And that might end, at the end of this Congress. So they are very anxious, I think, to get as much done as they possibly can in that window.
Yeah, no, and I think Ozzy's point on sort of the scar tissue is a really fascinating point. And Ike, actually, we talked about this on the phone a few weeks ago. We frequently, or he and I wonder, had the Obama administration actually pursued climate bill first, which probably had more bipartisan support. I mean, think back, there was a McCain-Lieberman bill, as opposed to going for the ACA. Would that first 2 years in office look a little bit different than it went? I think the ACA, well, my opinion was the ACA, I think was so incredibly fractious that they lost a ton of political capital. But I'd be curious what you guys think.
No, I think, it's hard to play Monday morning quarterback, but I think you're right. There wasn't a lot of Republican support for what they were doing on climate change, but there was some, and I think had they done that first, they would have gotten it through. I think they saw themselves having only one bite at the apple, and so I think they chose healthcare. And I understand their perspective, but we'd be in a vastly different world today. I think we'd probably be flipping, right? We'd be debating about some kind of new kind of healthcare debate now. So, but
I think it's also true that the dynamics have changed so much in Congress. The positions, I think, have hardened. And so when you talk about McCain-Lieberman or, something like that, there isn't really that something like that anymore. And so climate change at the time was a little bit less of a lightning rod. Healthcare has always been a dividing line with Republicans and Democrats in a way that other issues maybe haven't always been. But I think it was just a different time. Relationships were different. People's willingness to work together. It was pre, a lot of social media and that sort of thing. So I think it's just a fundamentally different premise now.
Yeah, and I think in comparing both of those to Chelsea's point, it's a little bit less politically toxic in what they're trying to do on the climate agenda, sustainability agenda. I don't think they may get some criticism from the far right as far as how far they're willing to go, or perhaps the timetable 2030 versus 2050. But in my opinion, they're not missing the mark by a bunch. I mean, you have industry in certain sectors that are already there. You've seen countless announcements by automotive manufacturers that they're going electric, and they're going electric hard and fast. You've seen a lot of a boom in ESG investing in the finance world. You're starting to see a little bit of a schism there between what we identify here in the U.S. from an investment standpoint of ESG to what the Europeans are doing. And you certainly have the inputs versus outputs argument that's starting to creep up. So again, unlike healthcare, where it's extremely divisive and it's extremely domestic focused, the Biden folks are looking at this climate proposal from an international lens, but also looking at it as a way to enhance American competitiveness. And whether they're right or wrong on timing and right or wrong on methods, I don't think from an economic standpoint they're missing the mark that much. So
I think that's a great point.
I was just going to add, can I just add one more thing, MACKAY? I think it's important to note that it started as an infrastructure and climate change, but it's about equity and justice, and whether that's racial, whether that's social justice. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous for us to call it like an infrastructure and climate change package, although it started there. It's turning more into, universal free healthcare and free college tuition, that sort of thing. So it's really about opportunity and kind of leveling the playing field. So sorry to cut you off. I just think it's grown significantly beyond the bounds of traditional infrastructure and climate change.
Yeah, and actually, I want to come back to that point in a second. One thing that I did want to ask you guys, because it surprised me, and it may not have surprised you. The last time that we really had the serious climate debate, again, I kind of remember it from sort of 2006 to 2010, let's call it. There was a lot of talk on monetizing or figuring out pricing schemes as it relates to carbon. There was a lot of talk about cap and trade. I remember Rudy Giuliani in the primary being an advocate of a carbon tax. There's really been no discussion around any type of either financial, creating financial markets around this, or a tax in any way, to my knowledge. Does that surprise you guys at all?
It doesn't surprise me in the context where I think they're trying to make it not as politically toxic as it could have been back then. But I also think, and I defer to Ike on this, but I think the economic conditions were vastly different back in 06, 010 timeframe. Back then, we were probably importing more energy resources than we were exporting. And today, we're, to Chelsea's point, whether you agree or disagree with policies from the previous administration, a lot of those policies have made us a net exporter in energy. So I think the economic dynamics are certainly drive the politics behind that. But again, they're also looking at this as, money's cheap, right? So they're looking at this as a way to double down while they can do that without having to have as much concern on the pay for side. But again, to Chelsea's point, they will take this kind of window to include a lot of more of their other tax policies into the mix. So I figured if they've got so many other fights on the financing side, why take on the cap and trade or carbon tax issue right now, particularly at this point, it may actually hurt us economically speaking. So
interesting.
So I think Ozzie's right? Why start a battle about taxes when you think you can get your agenda without that? I think the other thing is that if they were to impose some kind of carbon tax, I'm not sure it would give them the outcome they would want. In particular, what I think you'd see is that natural gas, which is not nearly as emissions intensive as coal or oil, would end up doing well, and it would probably even take more market share. And I think there's a big constituency in the Democratic Party that they have a technological idea of what they want to come out, and that's they want everything to be wind and solar. And natural gas, they don't treat it as a bridge fuel or a permanent fuel. Like, they see it as part of the problem. So they're trying to engineer the final outcome of this.
And so I want to go back to Chelsea's point earlier on this infrastructure climate change bill. It certainly seems to have become very broad, very wide in scope and scale. And the big question, I listen to Bloomberg all the time, and they love to ask this question: what is infrastructure? is the definition seems to be changing.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a broad definition by, the Biden American Recovery Plan, or American Jobs Plan, effort out there. And, there was a couple of Twitter memes that were out there from when Senator Gillibrand texted or tweeted something about infrastructure and calling childcare as infrastructure, and then it went on. But I do think that definition of infrastructure has broadened. I mean, I think if you take a look of, traditional roads, bridges, shovel ready, dare I say, that's still in there. But I think if, they're adjusting that definition based on what we just saw from the pandemic. I would argue, I think a lot of bipartisan agreement that broadband should be included when it may have not been included 10 years ago, and in large part because, it used to be that broadband argument was a rural issue. We're actually not seeing it in an urban setting where a lot of families have been set back because they didn't have internet connectivity during the pandemic. So I think the definition is certainly broad. Now, do I personally agree that the care economy is infrastructure, that community college is infrastructure? I think that's a bridge too far, no pun intended. But again, to Chelsea's point, they're taking these openings and trying to create as wide of a kind of landing area to get as much of that agenda pumped through. So
just a quick follow-up. I'm sure that pun was unintended.
It was totally unintended, but well played on my end, I guess. So
right.
Go ahead, Chelsea.
Please. I was going to say, Ike, did you want to chime in there?
I guess the one thing I would say is, look, infrastructure is long-term investment that increases the net productivity throughout the economy. So, yeah, I think he's right. Is that if you should be including things like laying cable or telephone wires or things like that, because that does add to long-term productivity. And, in fact, a dozen years ago, it was kind of on the other side, right? When I was working in the U.S. Senate, we were arguing that there was such a thing as private infrastructure spending when AT&T and Verizon were spending, $20 billion a year on this stuff. And the Democrats at the time didn't really see that as infrastructure. They've kind of come around. So I guess churlish if we were to say now, oh, no, that's not infrastructure after all. But I think Chelsea's point about the bill is apt, though, right? That this thing isn't really an infrastructure bill anymore. It's it's anything that we think we can get through in a reconciliation bill, and a lot of it's not going to get through. And so, I think they're just throwing everything, and they're kind of seeing what might have 50 votes, and then they're going to run things by the parliamentarian, and then they're going to try to whatever they absolutely can't get through on a bare majority, they're going to see what they can do on a bipartisan basis. And like Chelsea said before, it's a shame we're not at a spot where you can kind of have 40 moderate senators figure out what could be supported by 2/3 of the caucus. But I mean, that's where we're at.
Well, and you just hit on something that's so important. There's so much information about not just this piece of legislation, but the I mean, every bill or every political issue now. There's so much information, and the reality is, like, we know, like, practically only a few pieces of this is really going to move forward in any given situation. And I think a lot of people have a hard time really following what's real or what's a realistic outcome versus sort of a lot of the stuff that's just sort of like baiting people into political debates and creating wedges. So I guess my question, particularly as it comes to this bill, like, I don't ask you to predict the final outcome, but realistically, like, what do we think we'll see achieved in this?
I think. Oh, go ahead, Chelsea.
Please, Ozzie, jump into this breach, and then I'll agree with whatever you said.
I don't think it was lost on the Biden administration that they had certain hurdles to clear with how they proposed this infrastructure package, and you saw them divided into two pieces, right? You had the American Jobs Plan, and then next week you're going to have the whatever the human capital aspect of it they're calling it, the American Families Plan, I believe it is. But I think they understood that from a true infrastructure perspective, they were likely to peel off a couple of Republicans in supporting that, where everything else that came after the fact was probably a little bit more politically out there to the left than they would have gotten bipartisan support. So I think the other things to look out for about what we end up getting are the dynamics with the more moderate senators like Manchin and Sinema and others that are out there that have expressed concerns about using reconciliation over and over and over again. Obviously, they have a limited window on what they can use it for, as I referenced. But I think it becomes really hard to predict, that a massive package passes that includes all of their wish list because of the reconciliation restrictions, the fact that Manchin's out there on record saying, hey, I don't want to use reconciliation for infrastructure, it should be done bipartisan. You have Senator Coons, who I would argue is probably the closest Democratic senator to this administration, saying, well, let's split it up. We can have the carrot aspect of it and a bipartisan approach, and then we'll do our tax piece under reconciliation moving forward, which on paper looks great, but in practice, it's going to be pretty hard. So I would put, it's not a given that they're going to get their infrastructure bill done, certainly not anytime soon. I mean, you're going to have a big fight ramp up into the early fall. So.
And I think at some point it collapses under its own weight, right? Because it is a little bit of science, but it's a little bit of art to figure out exactly the balance to get just enough support, but not too much and be overambitious. I think the other thing that the pandemic has really laid bare is there are a bunch of existing challenges, whether they're infrastructure, whether they're childcare, whatever it is. But the pandemic really accelerated the conversation on a number of those things. I think OZZIE mentioned, broadband. That used to be just it's out in the wild. That was something that was just a very rural problem. But now that you have a whole year of students who maybe have missed school and didn't have adequate broadband, that's something else. Childcare was a big issue because people who were essential workers couldn't get to their jobs. So while it's a very specific snapshot in time, I think it accelerated the interest in doing something on that on both sides of the aisle in addressing some of those things. The question is, are they going to be addressed this in a way that both Republicans and Democrats can agree? And is it going to be part of this package? And I think that's what remains to be seen.
And we had a great question come in from someone in the audience, and I want to bridge to it right now because while I don't think this has to be answered in the context of this current bill, certainly this bill impacts a lot of companies and could have serious implications on segments of the economy. And this question is coming particularly from an early stage company or an entrepreneurial perspective. Washington, there's so many issues, or it seems like there's a constant flow of information agenda, similar to what I was mentioning before. And number one, I think for a smaller company, how do you figure out a way to kind of track and stay involved in the process? You're also competing with large companies that certainly have a lot of resources to lobby. How could smaller companies and entrepreneurs, I think, be more effective in the political process? I think both in terms of understanding policy, but also helping advocate or shape it.
So, the first thing I'd say is right now they should be aware that no one really knows how this is going to play out. No one's ever tried to do anything this expansive via reconciliation rules. And I'm with Chelsea. Like right now, I think that there's a good probability that the Biden administration has already hit its high mark and that this is going to collapse out of control. Right? Already they're banking on the parliamentarian basically going against hundreds of years of dozens of years of accepted rules about what the Byrd rule is and what it allows and what it doesn't allow. In terms of a smaller company trying to stay engaged and get their input into this, I think working with their trade association is always a good way, right? The trade associations usually hire really sharp people. I can think about it in the context of tax policy where I deal with a number of them. They also feel, there might be dozens or even hundreds of members, but they feel very attuned to their smaller members and like to get their input as well. They don't want to, they take great pains, the ones I know, to not be just representing the biggest members. So I would go that route.
I would add to that. Go ahead,
no,
OZZIE.
Please go ahead. No,
I would just add to that you have to.
Chelsea.
What I would say is, go ahead, Chelsea. Well, what I was going to say is also, I think people need to understand that by its sheer nature, Congress and policymaking is reactionary and it's not forward thinking. Typically, they're trying to solve problems that have already gotten to that level where it's got some sort of public impact. If you're an entrepreneur today, you're trying to solve a problem that policymakers haven't even thought of. And if you can kind of snapshot it right in time, there's a lot of discussion in Washington about what to do around cryptocurrency. Right. And this is something that obviously, again, Congress is likely to step into it, or the regulators will step into it at a time where the markets may have already, kind of lapsed where Congress or any policymaker is going to end up. So I think it's, to Ike's point, I think, leveraging trade associations, maybe even getting behind the wake of a bigger company to understand what their agendas is, you may benefit from that. And then at some point, you're going to get hopefully to the size where a specific piece of legislation has a direct business impact. But for the time being, I mean, if you're an entrepreneur or you're working at a startup, I mean, you're probably dealing with an issue that Congress hasn't even thought of. And in about a few years, they'll come to you to say, hey, we now have this problem. You've been in the sector for a while. Could you help us solve it?
Senator Hatch had a great quote he liked to say, you don't get any credit for solving a problem until everybody knows it's a problem.
Amen. And I would just add to that too, that as a small business, it can be really, whether you're an entrepreneur or whatever, it can seem really daunting. But I think the advice I would give too is just figure out what issue that you are dealing with, whether it's a regulatory issue, it's a tax issue, whatever it is affecting your business that's different from your industry. Because I think a lot of entities spend a lot of time wringing their hands about issues that pretty much the whole industry is aligned with, including them. So don't spend your political capital on issues that the whole industry is aligned with and it's going to break one way or the other. Really focus on what is parochial to you, what is something that is you are different from the rest of your industry, and you have to get ahead of it. That's how I would focus your time.
Good point.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of time working with entrepreneurs and earlier stage companies that are really doing innovative things. So it's to sort of Ozzie's point. Congress isn't thinking about a lot of these issues right now. And the same's true, I think, with starting a business. I always sort of counsel, you really have to prioritize. You have to prioritize what's important to your business, what's important to your customer. And from a policy perspective, what's really the most important thing to sort of shape, because it can be very easy to get focused on 100 different things. But the reality is there's probably one or two things that really are going to have to stand out, or it's worth the exercise to try to get down to that list of one or two things. And, one of the greatest places to start is your own member of Congress. I mean, frankly, like Chelsea reminds me this all the time, like your member of Congress is there to serve you. And that's one of the best entry points actually to getting into the process along the way. So. Anybody else have anything to add on that particular question? I thought it was a great question that came in from the audience. So.
Yeah, just to echo what Chelsea said and what you said, McKay, I mean, I wouldn't discount the importance of being able to bring forward a solution that they may not have even thought about. It's anecdotal, but I'll take a client that I'm working with now. It's a company called Zen Ledger, and they're working with the IRS on trying to figure out tax liability, around cryptocurrency. And this was something that when they brought to the IRS several years back, the IRS says, we're not even thinking about this and we're under resourced and we have no idea what to do. You fast forward a year and a half, 2 years, and this is prime example of where a lot of the debate around where additional tax revenues are going to come in. You have a lot of Democrats out there saying if the IRS was just better at their job and finding different pots of money, we could then put those resources to better use. So there, again, it's not necessarily a direct fit with the Zen Ledger model, but it's certainly now all of a sudden you're bringing forward a solution to say, well, I can help you find additional pockets of funding, which benefits the company from their growth perspective, but you're also helping them solve a political argument and a policy argument in an area that maybe they have not thought about to look for additional resources. So again, it's anecdotal, but again, to your point, finding your niche and understanding what's important to you and bringing forward a solution, there's never any harm in having that conversation first.
And I think you segued to another topic that I think's very much on the minds of folks, and that is related to tax. Today stocks really dropped is related to news of pretty substantial increase on capital gains for I think it was for wealthier investors, but there's also been a lot of discussion on corporate income tax as well, and this is one of these, the Republicans, I think, have been pretty firm to my knowledge in saying, tax isn't on the table. I think what are sort of your predictions on where this debate really goes? And what I really want to hit on is capital gains increases. Is that a realistic change? And then on the corporate side, I think the corporate tax, there's two very important things. There's the corporate rate, but then there's also the change from the current territorial tax system that the Trump administration moved towards to going back to the worldwide taxation system. So I know that was a few different things, but hopefully I broke it down okay.
I would just go back to what I said, in the beginning, that we went from one of the most business friendly administrations in recent memory to perhaps one of the less business friendly. And I think that To answer your question about, is there, for Republicans, is there any wiggle room on taxes? It's one of those bright lines for a lot of Republicans that fundamentally they don't believe that taxes should be increased to raise revenue. You should cut spending. There's just this, whether it makes mathematical sense or not, there is this feeling. And if you step outside that lane, you get clobbered for it. I think I would look to members like, the Joe Manchins and Kristen Sinemas, and they're talking about, okay, well, we're not going to go back up here with the corporate rate. We're not going to keep it here, but maybe put it right here. I think that's more realistic to go to maybe 25, 26%, but there's not going to be, I have a hard time seeing Republicans saying, okay, that much of an increase is okay. I think that it's such a bright line issue for Republicans. At the same time, it's changing a little bit as the demographics get younger, as younger members are coming to Congress. Their view on it is different, but I think that's one of those areas where Republicans, it's on every scorecard. It's on every, you get called a rhino, you get all of this guff if you even hint at increasing taxes. So I think it's a really difficult spot for any Republican to give any ground.
Yeah, we got this question a lot from clients post the November election. And I think with certainty, one thing you can bet on is taxes are going up, period. I think at the end of the day, how it's packaged is a big question mark. This ties a little bit into the term of bipartisanship and what that means. You have the Biden administration using the word bipartisanship to actually mean that it's got bipartisan support across the electorate and how they're polling. And much to people's surprise, there is pretty broad support across the American public that corporations should be paying their fair share. The traditional term of bipartisanship would be how many senators can we get from the other side of the aisle to support this, and they've kind of pushed that aside. But again, I think it's how it's packaged. It's going to be interesting. I think there's a higher probability that there are corporate adjustments than there are actually individual adjustments, just given, to Ike's point, how reconciliation is used and what the parliamentarian allows moving forward. But I think with certainty, you can guarantee that taxes in some way or shape or form will increase between now and the end of the year. To Chelsea's point on the corporate side, you'll likely have an increase in the overall corporate rate, falling in somewhere between where it's now and 28. So likely 25 is where Joe Manchin put the marker out there. You've got, proposals to find pay-fors around GILTI, basically a foreign source income. They're going to go after that. You have Secretary Yellen talking about a global minimum tax, and kind of falling in line with where the OECD is, and then a lot of this stems from the fact that, again, it's such a, you kind of opened up a can of worms here, MACKAY, but, if you take a look at calendar year 20, I mean, Washington spent $2.8 trillion, and it's just an unsustainable path, as far as from a fiscal house perspective. So at some way, some shape or form, we're going to have to pay for this. I will agree that from a, top line, taxes is obviously Republican orthodoxy to, thou shall not increase. But if you saw the proposal that came out today from Senator Capito and a bunch of other Republicans in the Senate, as to kind of counter their infrastructure, they talk about user fees. They talk about vehicles, taxing miles traveled or user fees on miles traveled in order to have parity between electric vehicles and gas vehicles. So there is certainly a kind of changing, so to speak, of the mindset where perhaps big taxes are off the table, but they're going to get creative on user fees and other ways to raise revenue because they know we need to figure out how to pay for things moving forward.
And they're going to call them user fees. They're not going to call them taxes, right? The vehicle miles traveled user fee rather than the vehicle miles traveled tax.
To be fair, but it is a user fee.
Right. Totally agree. They're very, very careful to characterize it as such. And I think it's an interesting part of the rhetoric.
And OZZIE, you brought up a lot of good points on bipartisanship. One of the questions that came in,
gas emissions, but also our smog emissions.
Ike, you kind of froze on us for a second, so we missed you.
Oh, so I was going to say, if you have these fees on people driving and you dramatically decrease the amount of congestion on the roads, that would do a lot to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and smog, which is just a bigger problem in big communities like Washington, D.C. So we conservatives should be for user fees, I argue. And then, I just want to say two of the little things about taxes to pick up on what OZZIE was saying. look, there's a reason for them to not, for Democrats to not necessarily drive that hard on raising the top individual rates, because those automatically go up in 2025 when the TCJA passes. That starts to, those provisions start to fall off, because those were only done for 5 to 7 years. And then the last thing that I'm not sure people realize is that this talk of a global minimum tax, where we're not going to look at tax reported profits, but book profits that you report to your shareholders, that's really a terrible, terrible precedent, right? That when I was at Treasury in 2007, 2008, we looked at that, and it really creates a lot of terrible incentives. There's a very good reason why we have tax, book profits, that you report to the government and then you report to shareholders, because they're providing two different sets of information. What we don't want, and obviously they manipulate the tax one somewhat, or they gear it up to reduce them, to reduce their tax obligations. But there's only so much you can do in the long run, and we don't want to encourage public corporations to do that kind of stuff on their personal books. We'd end up giving a lot less information, useful information, to shareholders. It would set a terrible precedent.
Ozzie, I want to hit back on you brought up a lot of points on bipartisanship. One of the questions from the audience actually was specifically to that point. Is bipartisanship realistic under the current filibuster rules?
Yeah, I mean, I would, one thing that got missed this week, amidst all the noise around Earth Day and the infrastructure rollout and the likes, was the fact that you had Senator Schumer be joined by Senator Todd Young from Indiana, a Republican, and present their Endless Frontiers Act, which is a bipartisan bill that's aimed at enhancing American competitiveness as a way to counter China. And then as part of that, Schumer had tasked 8 Senate committees to actually come up with bipartisan legislation that they could include into this Endless Frontiers Act. And that was totally overlooked, and in large part, and it's not to talk about fake news or to get political, so to speak, but that doesn't really drive ad dollars to the media, right? I mean, they want to see confrontation, they want to see friction. I was earlier today, I was on a video chat that Punchbowl News hosted with Senator Dick Durbin to talk about immigration reform. And he's got a group of about 10 to 12 senators, bipartisan, that have been regularly meeting, talking about immigration reform and what to do with respect to DACA and a pathway to citizenship. And, again, that doesn't get reported. People want to talk about the crisis at the border. So I don't think bipartisanship is dead. It's certainly harder to come by. But I do think you're starting to see a little bit of a hunger, particularly from the younger senators that have just come in within the last few years, to kind of roll up their sleeves and get something done. I would pay attention to this Endless Frontiers Act, because I do think it's got really broad bipartisan support. It's got a lot of industry support. I think it's taking a lot of kind of business sectors that aren't maybe quite ready for prime time, whether it's in AI or electric vehicle batteries or et cetera, and kind of using the government, in my opinion, where the government should be used, is kind of giving them that springboard forward. But again, that's a prime example of bipartisanship, and I think it's it's something to look out for. With respect to the filibuster, I mean, I think that the fight over the filibuster isn't going to happen on a China bill. It's not going to happen on an infrastructure bill. It's going to happen on HR 1, which is the voting, the John Lewis voting rights bill. You have senators out there that have laid out markers that they will not vote for filibuster or eliminating the filibuster, but Manchin has given himself a little bit of wiggle room to say he would support some reforms moving forward to force people to actually filibuster and speak on the Senate floor and the likes. So that's something that I think once you kind of get this infrastructure rollout and a couple of wins, so to speak, the big fight on HR 1 is going to force some real kind of deep discussions and consequences on what the filibuster looks like moving forward. And I think it's if I had to bet today, it's more likely that reforms are coming.
I think it's really important what Ozzie said about the China issue, because it is, Republicans and Democrats agree that something needs to be done to counter China. How they arrive there might be different. If, on the Democrat side, it might be more motivated by human rights violations and, that sort of thing. And on the Republican side, maybe it's a little bit more economic. But I think the thing they've really found a way to balance that and not worry too much about, well, how did we get here? And focus more on, okay, here's where we are. And, here's how we can move forward.
Great. So we got a couple of audience questions. I want to chat about one other thing that I think is important, probably to the audience, but also in general. It's just been discussed so much throughout the election, well, the past couple of elections. COVID aside, right? Like COVID's obviously a top priority for the administration, but beyond that, we haven't seen much as it relates to healthcare policy come from the administration. Now, I that's not a criticism. I acknowledge they're putting a pretty hefty agenda out there on plenty of other issues. But what should we anticipate from this administration on healthcare?
Well, one thing that they've talked about a lot is doing more to cap the cost of prescription drugs. So they haven't really fleshed that out, and I'm not sure what they can do. And I've written that this is really, I think, I don't think it's all that necessary, and I think it's kind of dangerous what the kind of things that they are supporting. And I think it would end up hurting research and development in pharmaceuticals if they go too far in that. But to me, it seems like that's what they've thrown around so far, or at least that's what's been talked about in the Senate.
Yeah, and I think there was a little bit of momentum earlier this week when a few House members were pushing for that prescription drug reforms to be included in the American Families Plan that they expect to roll out next week, and it's now been since pulled out. But MACKAY, I think politically speaking, in large part, why you don't hear a lot about it is because Republicans don't have a counter proposal to healthcare reform. And I say that as someone who largely works with Republicans. Why bring that up when you have the upper hand, and the fact that your proposal from several years back, which is Obamacare, is largely played out, it's intact, and there hasn't been a counteroffer to kind of have a political discourse or debate over. So it's a little bit of, if you know that a guy can't hit an inside fastball, why pitch him anything else? So just kind of play to your strength.
I think what Ike said is really important too, though, because prescription drug prices, whether you agree on how they should be addressed, that is getting more bipartisan attention than it has in the past. There are more Republicans who are saying, yeah, something's not right here than there have been in the past. And some of the old guard, for lack of a better term, who really understood how kind of the industry works and that sort of thing. But it's a very populist driven issue right now. And when you hear from a constituent that my prescription drugs are too expensive or whatever the case may be, I'm hearing more Republicans willing and open to discussing, okay, how do we address that? What do we do with it?
Yeah, one of the things that I hear a lot about is, this administration certainly wanting to try to move a little bit more towards a European, particularly a German style system where you have sort of a body that's not necessarily a quasi government entity. Let's call it that sort of would be the I like to call it drug pricing czar. Interestingly enough, in Chelsea, and I've seen this article, there was a company that actually just decided to not launch their product in Germany because they couldn't get the price reimbursed. And this is a tough issue because obviously you want to save patients' lives, you want to help patients live healthier lives. But there is a cost to innovation and there is a value to innovation, and that's my biggest fear, is that we start to move down this path where we sort of create organizations like ICER and empower health economists to be the decision makers instead of the patients and the doctors. But I'll get off my soapbox. Just a couple of quick questions from the audience, and these are above me, so I'm definitely leaning on you guys. Anything coming up in terms of cannabis legalization nationally?
That's a great question, and I think that there will be a push to do this in this administration. And when I was at working for the Republican leadership, Senate leadership in 2009, I wrote this memo, and I predicted that at some point in the next 10 to 12 years, it would be made legal. But not necessarily because there's been a morality change, but I just think we're going to need more revenue, and people are realizing that if we treated it like we treated tobacco and other things, that there are tens of billions of dollars we can make it. That's what's been driving, to be realistic, a lot of what the states are doing in terms of legalization. So, and right now, just having some states where it's legal and some states illegal is really causing a lot of problems. And I think there's a growing momentum to fix this. So, and there's fewer Republicans who I think are objecting to this. So I think it will happen in the Biden administration.
It's an important point, Ike, because the opinions are not changing so much as softening, and members don't care as much about it. Like, there were members who felt very strongly that it was, that this was something that you couldn't legalize, it was a gateway, and that view just isn't as common anymore as Congress gets younger, as it gets more diverse. I think that with experience, I think it's not as taboo of an issue, and I think you see a lot of Republicans who are kind of the opinion, like, more of the libertarian arm say, live and let live.
Yeah, nothing more to add on that. You have John Boehner serving on the board of a cannabis company, and
so true.
Again, the public opinion, I think, has kind of lapsed. Yeah, has lapsed on that, and I think, and I would probably agree with this, it's also a banking issue, right? I mean, you've got, to have a fragmented banking approach to how you treat cannabis is not something the industry wants, and it, you want to have kind of that continuity and at least predictability that, you're not going to get in trouble for doing what, for handling some sort of financing trade.
Here's one issue that related to what OZZIE was saying that I think still has to be worked out. So what we have right now is we have like the equivalent of a several hundred, maybe a couple thousand boutique marijuana growers, just like we have like a few thousand boutique beer brewers, right? But what's going to happen once we legalize this, that 80% of these will probably be wiped out by the equivalent of Marlboro. And so there's a lot of these supporters who are trying to figure out how can we get legalization without making this thing just become this gigantic national behemoth. And I think the answer is you probably can't, but maybe it'll take a little bit longer. So helping these people get a banking solution without opening this thing up to the big business is the goal. But these can't be reconciled.
To lighten up the conversation, MACKAY, I did have a pretty progressive friend from New York send me a text saying, I'm sitting outside with my family smoking weed, and who would have thought that smoking weed was not the illegal part. So.
That is funny. All right, so I have two questions on cryptocurrency that I'm going to try to merge together the best that I can, though they a little bit different. One's specifically related to national security implications and concerns around crypto mining based in China and Russia. Is anybody really kind of focused on that? And then the other, just to be a little bit more simply, is IRS willingness to accept. I think the question is crypto in as a form of revenue or credit.
So I certainly don't see the IRS taking cryptocurrency for this anytime soon, right? It's not. Most of them don't have a stable value. I do think China now having its own digital currency and being a place where a good chunk of this is mined, I think that has served as an impetus for the Federal Reserve to study in earnest whether they should have some kind of digital currency as well. So I do think that the United States government and Treasury and the Federal Reserve are starting to respond to what's going on with cryptocurrencies. I don't know what the future is for them. I guess they'll be around. The blockchain is really important, and I think that's going to be around. And it's difficult to extricate these two. So, but what currencies survive? How big these are going to be? I just have I have no clue.
Yeah, and to Ike's point, I think the focus there should be on what regulators end up doing and what they say. Yellen has been pretty far out there in talking about this. I think you're going to see Gary Gensler and others kind of get active and talk about what they plan to do. I think that China is kind of creating their own digital currency, raised eyebrows, and it's something you've had even former regulators like Jay Clayton and others come out saying that this is a huge concern for them. That's probably something, again, if you're in that space from an entrepreneurial startup perspective, I'd pay a lot more focus on what the regulators are doing than what Congress does. You know, if Congress is the smoke, the regulators are going to be the fire, because they're the ones that actually have the levers to actually regulate this. And, you know, I think they're being cautious in two fronts. One is they don't quite understand it fully, and the other is they don't want to stifle innovation. But I think crypto's here to stay. But they got to figure out how to wrap their heads around it, because it is a national security concern.
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that Congress is reactive, right? They're in the business of solving problems. And so if you are in that space, it's really important to educate members on what's harmful and what's helpful. And frankly, I think Ozzie put it kindly that most of them don't know a lot about it. Trying to explain what an NFT is to an 80-year-old member of Congress is a challenge. It just is. And, you know, I'm reminded of the late Ted Stevens when he was explaining the internet, that it's a series of tubes, right? So you've got these members who have to, it's a very difficult thing. And especially when you don't have some of the institutional knowledge, some of the, whether it's professional staff or whoever it is who have dealt with this, that's going to be an ongoing challenge. So I think it's really incumbent on those who are doing business in this area to educate lawmakers, to educate, participate in whether it's rulemaking period, but with the regulators as well.
Great. So I'd like to move on to the lightning round. We have only 5 minutes left, and we're going to make the best of this time possible. These are the fun questions, the predictions for the future that everybody wants to know. Will the Dems hold the House in 2022? Ozzie, what do you say?
I think the odds are against them, in large part just because of redistricting. Obviously, the Census Bureau has delayed a little bit of their data coming out based on the pandemic, which has forced states to kind of delay their redrawing of the map. But when you have states like California losing seats and Texas gaining a handful, Florida gaining some, et cetera, it's really hard for them to make that ground up. And again, today, I mean, the speaker has an extremely thin margin. I think she can afford today to lose 3 votes before Republicans kind of taking control. So just from a sheer numbers redistricting perspective, I think the odds are against Democrats holding it.
So my quick thought is that, we always have this pendulum going back and forth, right? One party holds more seats than they don't deserve. And so everybody says, oh, look, the administration always loses seats in an off-year election. But they already lost seats in 2020. I think this White House has fewer seats that it pulled in than any other administration since George W. Bush in 2000. So I think it's going to be, I don't think there's going to be a big move in either direction of the House. So I think it's going to be on a knife edge. I think it'll look like it does now. It'll be whoever has it will have a very narrow majority. And as a friend of mine who used to work for a couple of speakers said, the only thing worse than being in the minority is having a very narrow majority, because it quickly becomes impossible to do much of anything.
I think it's going to depend on whether the government or whether the populace accepts the president's new definition of bipartisan, right? Does most of the country support what he's doing, even if members of Congress don't? It's going to be a referendum on some of those things. And so I think it's going to put that definition to the test. But I tend to agree with Ozzie simply because there is such a so many steps ahead because of redistricting and because of other factors that give Republicans a leg up.
I'm a hard no and believe Republicans will make massive gains in the House. How about Dems holding the Senate?
I think there, as we sit here in April, I think the landscape for Democrats are a little bit more favorable on the Senate side going into it. I mean, I think just the sheer number of seats Republicans have to defend, and the fact that you've had retirements in some key states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Ohio, and Missouri. Those are seats that they have to hold. But it'll come down to a handful of states like New Hampshire, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And to Ike's point, I think McConnell said something similar earlier this year to the conference, where if you're going to be in the minority, 50 is going to be the number you want. But again, with having to defend as many seats as they have to, it's a pretty hard climb for Republicans to do that. But it's still pretty early. I think we're at the 100-day marker in the Biden administration is next week, as we talked a little bit about earlier. They're getting a little bit of their grace period, and they had a little bit of a later start than expected. But I think at the end of the day, with the easy stuff they're taking off the board, the more politically toxic issues, whether it's around immigration, healthcare reform, a lot of other campaign promises that they may not deliver, that's all going to impact that. So
there's also a cash advantage issue. In the wake of January 6th, there was a lot of kind of soul searching among corporate PACs and others. I think that Democrats have typically been better at fundraising in a lot of ways, and whether that's going to continue to be the case remains to be seen, but that will be a key issue. How much money can they raise?
I will point out that the NRSC did outraise the DSTC in Q1 this year by, and the Republicans do have a net cash advantage going into the second quarter. So that's a positive sign.
Ike?
Yeah, I don't know. I assume Republicans will not be able to pick up any seats in the Senate. I think Ozzie's right. The map is really against us.
The geography plus the retirements, I think, makes it tough for the Republicans.
And Ron Johnson might retire too, so then that's another seat gone.
So pick two of the most interesting elected officials that you think people should follow.
I'll pick a Republican Democrat. I think one is Kristen Sinema. Joe Manchin gets a lot of attention for kind of being the most vocal moderate and the one that's out there, but Kristen Sinema has proved herself to be probably the more one of the more serious policymakers. That's kind of a true purple state in Arizona. So I pay attention to what she does moving forward. And the other one, just for sheer entertainment, would be John Kennedy from Louisiana. I share a story I picked up this week when I was in DC. McConnell addressed the Senate conference, and it was following Trump's comments of Leader McConnell calling him a dumb son of a bitch. And, Senator Kennedy walked up to him and said, Mitch, I knew you were a son of a bitch. I just never thought you were dumb. And those are the kinds of nuggets that he puts out there. And if you've ever had the chance to watch him get interviewed or ask questions in a hearing, it's just worth doing so because he's brilliant, but he's like kind of having a funny old uncle. So. He
is great in a hearing. Like, he just gets right to the nub of the matter. Right. It's really remarkable. So I guess the other person I'd throw out Kennedy. Another person is Tim Scott. I think Tim Scott's a very bright guy who thinks about a lot of issues and is able to work in a bipartisan way. And I think he's going to take a run for the president.
He's delivering the Republican address to counter the State of the Union next week. So that'll be fun to watch.
I would add to that mix Abigail Spanberger, who's a second-term congresswoman in Virginia. She's a Democrat, but she has not supported Pelosi for Speaker, and therefore is relegated to not great committee assignments, and has had struggles. But she's been very vocal about what she views as the party going too far to the left, and there was this infamous conference call between all the Democratic caucus, and she, laced with F-bombs. What are we doing? What are you talking? Stop saying defund the police. Stop saying. And so she's paying the price. Like I said, she's not on these key committees because she's not supporting the speaker, but she knows her district and she's not afraid to speak out. So she's one who is worth watching.
And I'm going to go with one federal and one state. On the federal side, Adam Kinzinger, who Ike introduced me to, I think during his first run. Yep. I absolutely love what he's doing right now, and I think he's a real leader in Congress. The second is George P. Bush, who will be the next Attorney General of Texas. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for participating. I want to thank our panelists first for doing this, and I hope the audience. I really appreciated the engagement on the questions. We got some really interesting questions along the way, and I hope we shared some informative insights on what's going on in DC. So we thank you all for the time, and we'll look forward to doing this again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Be well.
Bye.